So we are going to do a sheep brain dissection. And the first thing that we are going to take a look at are the external structures, because as soon as you start to remove the protective layers of the brain, some of those external structures also go with it. So this is the superior portion of the brain, and this is actually the cerebrum. But this kind of white material you see here, this is part of the meninges. Now, the meninges, they are a protective layer around our central nervous system, and it goes around the brain and all the way down through the spinal cord. But this thick outer layer of the meninges is actually referred to as the dura mater. It translates into tough mother. When we start to take this off, you'll notice that it is really thick in some areas, and it's really difficult for you to tear it in any easy capacity. On the underside of the brain, so the inferior surface, we can see that the dura mater actually is not covering these two regions that are in the most anterior portion of the brain. These are cranial nerve 1, the olfactory bulbs. The olfactory bulbs are responsible for our sense of smell, so they are a sensory cranial nerve, and they have chemoreceptors on them that directly connect to the nasal cavity. And they're really unique because of the fact that they have that direct connection. Most all other receptors in our body are actually protected, so there is something else that the stimulus has to go through. Now, as we move our way from the anterior region to the posterior region, you're going to notice a couple other structures. This giant yellow thing, this is actually a fat pad that was surrounding the eye. And I am actually going to trim that guy off, so that way we can see a couple of the other structures that were hiding underneath it. So this Y that you're seeing, this is actually cranial nerve number 2. This is the optic nerve, which is taking the sensory or afferent signal from the eyes to the region of the brain that is responsible for our visual reflexes. And what's really cool about the optic nerves is that they cross in the middle here at something called the optic chiasma. And chiasma in the world of biology means crossing, but part of the signal from your left eye actually crosses over and gets processed in the right side of the brain. Part of it from the right eye gets processed in the left side. And then the next structure that we can see as we work our way to the posterior portion is this thing that almost looks like a little bean. Now, this little thing is our pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is responsible for many, many endocrine functions. A lot of hormones are secreted from the pituitary gland to the rest of the body. And then as we keep going down, this section right here, this is the brainstem. And the brainstem has 3 sections to it. There is the midbrain, there's the pons, and the medulla, and then it is continuous with the spinal cord. So in order to see these other structures, we want to remove that dura mater. And the easiest way to actually remove the dura mater is to trim the dura between the olfactory bulbs. And then you take your scissors and you cut along the optic nerve. I'm actually going to cut through that one, but I'm going to keep working my way to the posterior portion, to the brainstem, and all the way down through that dura. And then I am going to do that same thing on the opposite side. And my goal right now is to try to not remove the pituitary gland when I take off the dura mater. And sometimes the delicate connection between the pituitary and the rest of the brain rips pretty easily. So once I get the dura mater starting to be removed, you can see I can kind of just peel this all the way around. I'm going to have to cut another cranial nerve down here. And what I am holding, this is the dura mater. And the dura mater is actually like a really, really thick plastic type material almost. But there are some regions that if you look and see how thick that is, that was going into some of the fissures that are separating regions of the brain. The other thing that it will be hard to see on this particular video is as I was tearing that off, there was some webbing that was coming with it. And the webbing is part of the arachnoid layer of the meninges. That is where a lot of the cerebral spinal fluid will move through. And then the shiny material that is still connected to the brain itself is actually the pia mater. Pia mater translates into soft mother. So we are going to continue with our observations of the external structures now that that dura mater has been removed. So this part that has all of the wrinkles to it, this is the cerebrum. This is where our higher functioning skills come from, our logic and our reason. And the raised surfaces are called gyri, and the indents where you can see some blood vessels that are running through them, those are the sulci. And separating the hemispheres, so we have our our left hemisphere and our right hemisphere. This is the longitudinal cerebral fissure that literally separates the left half from the right half of your brain. Then as we work our way posterior, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is responsible for coordinating our movement and for maintaining our balance. And you can see part of the spinal cord coming out from underneath it. So I'm going to flip the brain over so we can look at the inferior surface. And I was able to keep the pituitary gland intact, which, if it will allow me to show it on the video, if I lift this up, there is a little stalk right here called the infundibulum that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. And we'll get into the functions of the hypothalamus and the internal structures when we open this up. So the pituitary gland has a very small connection, and underneath the pituitary gland, I am actually going to remove it at this point in time because I want to show you some other structures. And I am going to try my best to take off the rest of the dura mater to make everything show up a lot more clearly for you. All right. So when I took off the rest of the dura mater right here, this little spot where I have the probe, that's where the infundibulum was connected to the pituitary gland. The optic chiasma was here, which I ended up ripping as I was pulling the dura mater, and the optic nerves would have gone to the left and the right. So as we look at the brainstem, so this whole region that I am circling is the brainstem. We have the midbrain, which is this portion. Then the midbrain, as we move our way posteriorly, we have this swollen bump that is a little bit wider than the ones below it. But this is the pons. This section is the medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata is connected to the spinal cord. So as far as the functions of the brainstem goes, I cannot overemphasize how important the brainstem is to us. It is responsible for taking the communication from our peripheral nervous system through our spinal cord to the rest of the brain. There's a lot of life-sustaining activities that are also happening in this area. They're basically centered in this region. And the medulla portion, so this portion again, is responsible for our visceral reflexes. So basically, it's responsible for controlling our heart rate and our breathing rate. And then the pons has similar functions to the medulla, but it also carries the information to and from the cerebellum, which is just superior to it. So again, there is a lot going on in this area. Now, if I flip the brain over, I'm actually going to try to get this to show for you. We have our cerebellum, which if you remember, that's the coordinating movement and maintaining balance. As I kind of try to tease this down, you can see that there is connective webbing. That's actually the arachnoid matter. And as I keep sort of pulling this down, I am going to expose a region of the brain, and this is actually an extension of the midbrain. This is the corpora quadrigemina. It gets its name from the fact that there are 4 sections to it where the quad is coming from. This also is sometimes referred to as the tectum, and the upper 2 bumps are referred to as the superior colliculi, or they could be considered the anterior segments of the tectum. This is where we have our visual reflexes being processed, and then the inferior colliculi are responsible for the auditory reflexes, so hearing. And then if I try to tease apart this little section right here, I am also going to be exposing another gland. This is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is responsible for producing melatonin. It actually has a role in our endocrine function and sleep and that kind of a thing. So this region is still part of the midbrain. When we go to do the sagittal section, you will be able to see each half of that a little bit better. What we are going to do is go along this longitudinal fissure that separates our hemispheres. And you want to try to be as centered as possible. And as I'm kind of cutting, I'm opening. And I've got the cerebrum separated, and now I'm going to do the same thing for the cerebellum and working my way through that midbrain. So when you open it up, you can actually see that the cerebral cortex is where the gray matter is, which is what houses the cell bodies of your neurons. And then you have your white matter, which there's a lot of internal white matter in the brain because those are the myelinated axons that are connecting different areas of the brain together. And to connect the hemispheres together, there is a structure referred to as the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is actually the upper portion that's really white right here that I'm running my probe along. And then the bottom portion that you see is referred to as the fornix. And in between those, there's actually a space. And this space is called a ventricle. Ventricles are where cerebral spinal fluid is being produced, and it helps to nourish the brain. But if we kind of try to tease into this one, I may do it on the opposite side because there's a lot more that I can see. This is called the choroid plexus. It's basically a lot of those ependymal cells that are filtering the blood to get the constituents for the cerebral spinal fluid. They're also ciliated, so they help to move the cerebral spinal fluid around. Now, there is a ventricle to the left and there is a ventricle to the right. And combined, we just call these the lateral ventricles, but they are actually the first ventricles in this system, or rather the first and the second. So as we kind of work our way out of the lateral ventricles, we can come into this region just underneath the pharynx. This is the third ventricle, which also has the choroid plexus. And then there is a cerebral aqueduct that travels down past the cerebellum. And in the middle of the cerebellum, there is also more choroid plexus. This would be the fourth ventricle. And then that would cycle all throughout the brain, and each area produces a little bit more cerebral spinal fluid. So we have our lateral ventricle, our third ventricle, and our fourth ventricle, and third and fourth are connected by that cerebral aqueduct. So as we are looking at the halves of the brain, what you can see is in this section right here. This is the midbrain, or where the cerebral peduncle was from the outside. The bump right here was the pons. The elongated bump is the medulla, and then you have your spinal cord. If you're trying to remember the sequence of them, think PMS, pons, medulla, spinal cord. And remember, this is where the visceral functions are coming from, our visceral reflexes. So there is this interthalamic adhesion region, this kind of circular section right here that I cut through. This is part of the thalamus, and just below the thalamus right here would be the hypothalamus, literally meaning below the thalamus. The hypothalamus is important in so many different functions of our body. It's basically the control center for hunger and thirst and your sex drive and your emotions and osmoregulation and body temperature. So in addition to all of those control center things, it is also what signals what hormones are going to be produced by the pituitary gland that's right below it. If you notice that the cerebellum has this really, really cool feature to it. This is probably one of my favorite structures in the brain. It's called arbor vitae, or tree of life, where it literally looks like a branching tree into the cerebellum. The cerebellum also contains about 50% of the neuron cell bodies in all of our brain. So it has quite a bit of importance when it comes to everything. We have covered the external portion of the brain. We have covered the internal portion. And I do want to point out that you can see right here the corpora quadrigemina. It's also right here on the opposite side. All of the features that you are responsible for knowing, you can see from multiple views.